2, 1.
Good evening and welcome to P&P Live. I'm Brad Graham, the co-owner of Politics and Prose, along with my wife, Lissa Muscatine. We have a really interesting program for you this evening featuring Suneel Gupta and his new book, Backable, with information and insights likely to be of use to many of you. Suneel is currently on the faculty at Harvard, teaching a course on innovation, of which he has a fair amount of experience. He, some years ago, started a company called Rise, which is a company that uses technology to reduce the cost of quality healthcare. And before that, he had a couple of more challenging even business experiences, setbacks and disappointments. And his experience at learning how to persuade others to take a chance on him and invest in his ideas is what provided the motivation for his new book. In Backable, he argues that being successful often has less to do with talent, connections, or ideas than with inspiring others to believe in and even bet on you. And to make his case, Suneel draws on a wide range of examples, revealing, as his subtitle says, the surprising truth behind what makes people take a chance on you. Now, that sounds rather bold and intriguing, but Suneel himself is evidence that the lessons he describes can actually work. In conversation with Suneel will be someone else who has also known success, Suneel's older brother, Sanjay, who's no doubt familiar to all of you CNN watchers out there. Sanjay is CNN's chief medical correspondent, a frequent contributor to numerous CNN shows, and he also somehow manages to treat patients as a practicing neurosurgeon in Atlanta. Plus, he's the author of 4 books, most recently Keep Sharp, which came out last month and offers advice about how to maintain a healthy brain. For those of you not familiar with how this virtual format works, although you're not visible to us, you'll still be able to ask questions if you like. To do so, just click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen. The chat function also will be active, and in that column, you'll find a link for purchasing copies of Backable and also copies of Keep Sharp. So Suneel and Sanjay, the screen is yours.
All right. Thank you very much. What a pleasure to be here. I think the best part of writing books, Suneel, is that we get to have this sort of fun now. I get to ask you some questions in this format, and it says, if no one else is listening, just you and I. You're not nervous,
Mom and Dad. I think Mom and Dad might actually be on.
Oh, Mom and Dad are on. Okay, well,
I think they're out there somewhere.
Well, that makes me nervous then. That I'm nervous. Hey, I'm really excited about this, and let me just say at the beginning, because we're going to talk all about the book, but I just want to say first of all, I'm really proud of you. This is an amazing thing that you've done, and it's a really great book. I've read it a couple of times, and it's fascinating because we all take in lots of information, but I remember when I was reading this book of yours, I was making notes throughout. There were things that I wanted to immediately share with people, and it's just done really well. And I mean, look, people are going to say I'm your older brother, I'm biased, and there I'm saying these nice things, but the thing is, it's true. It's true. So we'll get into some of the specifics there, but I think I'm allowed to say that I'm proud of you, also in part because when they say older brother, I am 10 years older than Suneel. So in many ways, I'm like a third parent. So not like I'm a third parent saying that I'm proud of you. So think of it that way. Suneel and I are brothers, and amazingly, our parents had 2 sons, and amazingly, Suneel and I have 5 daughters between the 2 of us. I have 3 daughters. He has 2 daughters, and you might see some guest appearances tonight, which would be a treat. Although I think your kids are young enough where they're still talking to you a lot. Mine, not so much sometimes. But I got to tell you, the story starts actually with kind of the birth of Serena, the most recent Gupta girl, and I still remember this. It was 2016, the holidays. We were visiting, obviously, Serena and you, and you showed me the proposal for Backable. And I take in so much information all the time that you get good at like taking a look at something and immediately, what is this all about? Is it going to work? I remember looking at that and saying, this is amazing. I would read this book, absolutely. What was it that sort of inspired you to do it? What is it in the book and your inspiration?
Yeah, I remember you and I were having this conversation when I handed the proposal to you, and I remember thinking to myself, you know, creativity and persuasion are two different things, two different skills. But oftentimes we sort of treat them as one. But you could have a great idea, you could have a great vision, you could be a great candidate for a job and still be dismissed. And the thing that got me really interesting, it was this idea that there are these backable people out there that are able to go into a room and they're able to mystify us. They're able to sort of, I think, rally us kind of around whatever it is that they're putting on the table. That could be an idea, that could be them applying for a job. But even if sometimes they're not the most obvious choice, we want to take a chance on them. And I got really interested, and this was in fall of 2016. I started to really get interested in this idea of like, what is it about these people? What is that it quality? And can it be learned?
Mm. Were you, how much of this was just self-reflective? I mean, because you say you've been in these situations, right? And so are you thinking, okay, I saw quality in that guy. I can't quite describe it. How much of it was about your own personal journey?
Yeah, I mean, at the time I had started a company called Rise. It was focused on healthcare, one-on-one nutrition coaching, right over your mobile phone. And I'd gone out and I'd started to pitch investors, and I thought it was a winning idea. And I also thought that I had all the sort of ingredients of what it took to pitch something. I felt like I had proven out the market. I felt like I'd sort of thought about what the user experience was going to be, all the things that you kind of think about when it comes to presenting an idea. But when I got inside the room, it wasn't coming together, and I was getting rejected by every investor that I pitched. And I thought to myself, what am I doing wrong here? And yeah, I was seeing other people who seemed to have an idea that was just equally evolved, where there was an equal amount of risk associated with it. And yet they would go into a room and the investors would say, look, we really think this is a winning idea. Right. And again, I think, you could have a quality idea and not a quality explanation. And ultimately that reflects as a poor idea. And so, ultimately what really got me interested in this topic was when I started to make adjustments, when I started to spend time with backable people and I started to make these adjustments, the room started to respond differently, but it was the same idea. It was simply presented differently. So, I thought to myself, where else is this happening? Right. It's not just happening in startups. It's not just happening in entrepreneurship, but, ultimately backable is not just for celebrities. It's not for CEOs. It's really for anyone. There's not a single person out there who isn't trying to become backable in some way. It could be with hiring managers, investors, clients, colleagues, even friends and family.
Yeah, that's something that really struck me right away, Suneel, because I'm not a business person, so I'm not necessarily making those sorts of pitches. But that you're absolutely right. I mean, the lessons learned, I think, are pretty universal here. By the way, when you were describing that, what's that guy got? I don't have. You remember that FedEx commercial? There was a FedEx commercial. All these people sitting around the room. Yeah. I was like, we should use FedEx, and everyone's like, I don't think so. Another guy goes, I've got it. We should use FedEx. And
totally,
like, yes.
He's like, you just did what I did, but you did this. And he's like, no, I did this.
Right. But I mean, that's the sort of joke. And it's funny because Rebecca, your sister-in-law, my wife, she and I were talking about your event tonight and Backable, and she's read the book as well. And it's funny because we will have these conversations sometimes with friends, and we're ultimately sometimes making the same point, but for some reason, a person's message gets across differently. And so I guess it comes back to the original thing. What is it then? Because here's what I think. I think backable, and this is just my own naive thing, thinking of, I'm a non-Silicon Valley guy. I'm thinking, slickly dressed guy, or woman, whoever it may be, who's speaking very clearly, has just a polish, just that sort of slickness to it. Although I know that that's not at all what this book is about. I think that's where a lot of people go and they say, well, how do you dress the part, or how do you be the part of backable? What did you find?
Yeah, I mean, I thought that that was going to have a lot to do with this. I assumed when I started writing this book that what I was going to find a certain style of communication that backable people had. There was a certain use of eye contact, pacing, hand gestures. There was just going to be patterns there. But I honestly could not find that pattern. There were certain backable people, of course, that do have that do speak very eloquently, and they kind of almost seem very Dale Carnegie-esque, Toastmasters-esque. But then there are plenty of backable people who actually are more shy, quiet, introverted, and don't have those natural communication styles. And so what I found. By the way, if you want an example of that, you can go look up the #1 most popular TED Talk of all time, and it's a guy named Sir Ken Robinson. And what you might be surprised to find is a very un-TED-like presentation. He sort of has one hand in his pocket. He's got a bit of a slouch. He sort of meanders on and off script, but it's this brilliant talk, most popular TED Talk of all time. The point is that I think that being convincing, it's not charisma necessarily that makes a person convincing. It's conviction. What backable people do, and I think what binds backable people together, is that they spend the time to convince themselves first before they try to convince others. And then they let that conviction shine through in whatever style it is that feels most natural to them.
It seems like so. Again, I read the book, so we're having this discussion in some ways about something that I've read and I've absorbed and I've thought a lot about. What makes up conviction then, right? I mean, so charisma may not be the critical ingredient, but if conviction is, is there a strategy for getting to conviction?
Yeah. Well, it's funny. You were bringing the FedEx commercial, right? And it's like, guy has a brilliant idea. He blurts it out and it gets dismissed. I think we can all kind of relate to that experience in some ways. One of the things we found was that we were looking at how sort of ideas are shared within companies. And, what does it take for somebody who doesn't have authority to bring an idea that bubbles up to the top? And one of the things that we found is that ideas typically inside companies don't get killed in the conference room. They actually get killed inside hallways. They get killed around water coolers, because what ends up happening typically is that moment of inspiration kind of hits us, and we want to share that idea immediately. We want to, guys, I got the best thing. Let me share it with you. The problem with that is oftentimes the excitement that we get in return doesn't match what we feel inside. And when that happens, it can be deflating. We'll take the idea, we'll put it in a drawer there somewhere, a mental drawer, and we'll kind of we'll leave it alone. And that happens all the time, and it happens with great ideas. And so one of the specific things that I think backable people do is they take that moment where they think to themselves, is this an idea that I have high conviction for? Like when it hits me, is this something I have high conviction for? And if I do, then by all means, let me share it right now on the spot. But if I don't, then let me actually give it a little bit of time. Let me resist that impulse to put it out there in this moment, even with friendlies. And let me just take it back and do what I call giving it incubation time. And during incubation time, you're nurturing the idea. And people have different methods on how to do that. I love just a clean sheet of paper, like literally just writing my idea out. And one of the things that I like to do when I'm incubating an idea is I like to steer towards the positives, but I also like to point out the negatives, right? Like what if I was a critic of this idea, what are the top 3 objections? And I'll start to answer those objections. Now, I may not have a perfect answer for an early idea, a new idea. Most of the time we won't. But what ends up happening is we start to, well, I like to say, turn a chocolate M&M into a peanut M&M, or a chocolate M&M, if you squeeze it, immediately cracks. But a peanut M&M, as you know, I love these. If you squeeze them, it won't crack just as easily, right? It's not stone yet, but it's a little bit more robust. And what you're doing during this time is you're putting a peanut inside your M&M.
I love it.
None of that's in the book, by the way.
We're good. We're getting extra material here. I love peanut M&Ms as well. I think you got it from me. But one thing, just before, because I want to talk about some of the people in your life and more examples of people who we may know even in common who are backable. But going back to the idea that you, in some ways, want to be your own critic, and that's part of the incubation process. So do you present the problems then along with the pitch? I mean, what is the strategy? Do you lean into that, or do you lean away from that?
I think you lean into it. You know, one of the people that I studied for this book is Reid Hoffman. He's founder of LinkedIn. He was on the early team at eBay. And before that, he was at Apple. And, you know, so Silicon Valley kind of through and through. But, you know, it was interesting to hear Reid talk about his career, because when he was at Apple, he wanted to be a product manager. He wanted to work on the product side of the organization. It was the sexy place to be at Apple. But the problem was that a lot of people wanted to work in the product side. So, you know, people were approaching the head of that group and they were asking for a job. And oftentimes they would be dismissed. So Reid decided to take a different approach. He walked up to the head of the product group and he said, look, I know I don't have experience here. I know I don't have the right resume, but would you give me a shot at pulling together a document with all of my ideas? And if I pulled that together, would you take 5 minutes and just read it? And the guy said, sure, why not? And he did. And that kind of sort of opened up his career into product management. Years later, when he was starting LinkedIn, it was 2003, the bubble had just burst. Investors were not looking to invest in companies based on eyeballs anymore. Remember, they used to measure eyeballs. How many eyeballs did you have on a site? Now it had to be real revenue. But the problem was that LinkedIn wasn't making any money at that time. So what he did is he decided to take the same approach. When he got into the room with investors, he said, look, I want to just point this out from the top. We're not making any money. We don't have a dime of revenue. But here are the three ways. Here are the three things that we plan on doing over the next few years. And here's why I think each of those three things can work. And what he said was that steering into objections, which is what we talk about in the book, steering directly into the objections, didn't mean that he had a perfect answer. But when you don't steer into objections, what ends up happening is those objections are probably nagging at the person on the other side of the table. And so they're kind of tuning out the rest of your pitch anyway, because they have these underlying questions that haven't been answered. Point. But as long as you've kind of put that out there, again, it may not be perfect, but at least then they'll turn into the stronger parts of your pitch. They'll pay attention.
Yeah, I mean, I think just the fact that you've obviously anticipated these potential things, you know, I think
that's right,
would give somebody a lot of confidence. We're getting some questions in already, and we're not going to go to questions yet, but I want to read this one to you, Suneel, so you can percolate on it. It's a good question. It's from Ronnie Selig, who says, what is the one idea you had that you still believe should have been backed? What did we miss out on? I think when she says we, I think she means the world. So you don't have to answer that yet, but just think about it. That one idea that you think should have been backed, maybe wasn't, and maybe why not? And now with everything you've learned writing this book, might you go back and do it again? But who were some of the people like that we know, or that you write about in the book that were backable?
Gosh, I mean, I think we grew up around some people who were certainly backable. I think that just look at Mom's story. Mom grows up as a refugee on the border of Pakistan and India, and decides that she wants to become an engineer with Ford Motor Company. And Nani and Nana get behind the dream. They save everything they have to get her on a boat, to get her to the United States, where she gets a scholarship to Oklahoma State University. The day after she graduates, she travels to Detroit, Michigan, where she applies for a job. And the hiring manager gets into a room. He looks at her resume, he looks at her application, and he's like, well, are you applying for the job of an engineer? And she said, yes. And he's like, well, I'm sorry, we actually don't have any female engineers working here right now. Because this was the 1960s, and Ford Motor Company, while it has thousands of engineers on staff, not a single one of them is a woman. And so, Mom picks up her resume, picks up her purse. It's this deflating moment. She's about to walk out of the room, and then she turns around and she looks this guy in the eyes and she tells him her story about all the struggle that had to happen for her to get to this country, to get to Detroit, to get to this very room. And then she says to him, look, if you don't have any female engineers, then do yourself a favor and hire me now. And that was the moment that a middle manager from suburban Michigan decided to take a chance on a refugee from the other side of the world.
Pretty good chance he took. I mean, she's first woman engineer, completely changed, I think, the way that we think about women in engineering, sponsored all these other movements. It's kind of incredible. It does make me ask, and again, we're getting some of the specifics, but I'm going through this now because Sage, who's my oldest daughter, she's starting to think about colleges, and you're looking at all these essays and things like that. Again, and this idea that things are universally translatable, like the skills in Backable will be used by her. But how important is it, do you think, to have overcome some sort of hardship to be considered more backable, in the sense that, look, if you've not been challenged in some way, like mom was, like a lot of the people that you're talking about were, does that make it harder to be backable?
I think that the vast majority of the backable people that I studied, from Oscar-winning filmmakers to Michelin star chefs to iconic founders, leaders inside companies, went through their share of failure, had setbacks, and I think that the thing that I think was the pattern that I noticed is that each of them seemed to adopt a mantra, which I've sort of taken on myself now, which is that the opposite of success isn't failure, it's boredom.
Hmm.
Be able to work on things that really sort of matter to you. The outcome certainly matters. You're trying to achieve something. The outcome certainly matters. But the idea of being able to work on something that you are sort of bringing into the world, that you care about, I think is a reward in and of itself. We were talking a little bit about Rise earlier on, and you know the story behind Rise, Sanjay, but a lot of people probably don't, which is that I ended up selling the company. But when I sold the company, it wasn't like a home run in Silicon Valley sort of language. It was a double at best. And I signed sort of the paperwork with sort of mixed feelings, because I felt like we could have been more.
Mm.
And a few months after we ended up selling the company, I'm at a conference. It's a healthcare conference, and there's another founder who's up on stage. And this founder is, like, at this point, the founder. Like, everybody is sort of paying attention to this person, and I'm in the audience, and I'm kind of like, I feel that little bit of envy of, like, I wish I could be that guy up on stage. And we get to Q&A, and someone asks him the question, what inspired you? Like, what inspired this? It was a mental health care company. Like, what were some of the things that inspired this? And he said, one of the companies that I looked at when I was starting this company was Rise. It was one of the companies that inspired me.
Wow.
Now, he didn't know that I was in the audience, but I guess what that taught me, and what I've seen over and over again through these backable moments, these backable stories, is that even if we don't reach our intended destination, we still touch and teach people along the way, and that can be an incredible reward in and of itself.
I think that's frankly, one of the most important lessons I really took away from the book. I mean, we always have to in some ways determine what our metric of success really is. Backable because the company went on to do X, because it had such and such impact, because it allowed me to utilize a skill set and bring something that I think is important to the world, whatever it may be. I think it's such an important point. By the way, as far as the story about mom, I was just thinking, who mom was backable, but who was the ultimate backer of mom? Was Nani, was her mom. I mean, it's an immigrant story. We talk about it all the time, but the idea that so many of these immigrants, they were the ultimate backable people. They had to convince their families against all odds, frankly, with not very much in the way of resources, certainly, in terms of money and things like that, to take a chance on them. Like, I think I'm a father of 3 daughters now. I don't know that I would have had the resolve to do the same thing. I don't know. Maybe I would if I was challenged, but it is a remarkable story. I want to ask about some of the specifics, but just if you can, for the audience, how did you go about then writing this book? How did you approach it?
Yeah. Spending time with backable people, understanding what their methods were, like really just trying to reverse engineer it, right? But I think that in order to do that, you kind of have to think about it from both sides. You have to talk to the person who got backed, but you also have to talk to the person who backed them. So going then to their backers and saying, like, what was it about them? Like, why did you really decide to take a chance on them? and what comes out of that are these stories that eventually start to form these patterns. And what I tried to do is I try to then take these patterns and apply it to my own life. Again, I was out there raising money for my own company and trying to understand, like, what is it that I was doing wrong? How do I bring that into this process that I'm in right now to raise the money that I need to make this thing happen? So for example, one of the people that I studied in the book is someone I think you know really well, with Brian Grazer, right? And Grazer is, I'm sitting in his like waiting room where people are ready to pitch him, and they're there to pitch him on all sorts of things. They're there to pitch him on film ideas, television ideas. He invests in technology companies.
He's a big
runs
movie
large teams.
producer. For those people who don't know, Brian Grazer and Ron Howard make tons of films. So that's the guy. He's constantly getting pitched. And so I go back and see Brian Grazer and I ask him, like, you got a room full of, seemingly nervous people out there. If I was to go out there and give them one piece of advice, what would it be? He thinks about it for a moment. He says, give me something that I can't easily find on Google. Give me something that's not easily Googleable. And it was interesting because when I went and talked to these backers, I started to hear that same thing over and over again, that great ideas and great candidates for jobs, great interviews tend to be based on some sort of insight that you walk into the room with, that not a lot of other people in your shoes are probably going to know, but because you've taken the time to interview customers, to test drive the product, to maybe attend meetups that people may not have attended, and just really kind of dig in one level deeper. I was talking to somebody the other day who was applying. She's a mother. She's re-entering the workforce, and she's applying for a job at a social media company. The challenge was that she didn't really use this product. It was kind of a Gen Z kind of product. So she did something remarkable, though. She went out and she interviewed every single one of her daughter's friends, every one of them. And then on top of that, when she was interviewing them, she was asking them, what are these moments that you like about the experience? What are the moments that kind of stand out to you? What do you wish was different? And then she would have them send her screenshots of their experience. So then she goes into this interview, which is over Zoom, the way you and I are right now. And she has her phone with her, and she's literally showing this hiring manager these screenshots that she's collected. And this guy is so impressed that not only does she get the job, but in the middle of the interview, he actually pulls in one of the UX designers right into the Zoom so that they could actually see some of these insights that she's collected, right? Just by putting herself into the story, just by going beyond Google and finding what I call in the book an earned secret, something that she found through firsthand experience that she can share. I think it sets the tone for, I think, a successful backable moment. It's interesting. I'm thinking as you're saying that, if you're getting pitched, there's probably two prevailing thoughts that are going through your head. One is this a viable business, if it's a business pitch, or a viable story, if it's a story pitch. But the other is, I think, exactly what you're saying, which is, I think human beings can't help but contextualize things in their own life. You're telling me a story, a product about something that might be appealing to, young ladies. I have 3 daughters. I'm immediately imagining, would they be using this, that sort of thing. By the way, as you well know, Suneel, follow our daughters and see what they're doing at any given time, and that'll probably be a pretty good idea of what you should be pitching.
It's a pretty good idea. So, it's funny because I was thinking about that today. With one of the things we talk about in the book is the difference between something that's new and exciting and something that's inevitable. Right? And oftentimes when we get inside a room, we want to present an idea. We talk about why it's new, why it's exciting, but oftentimes we miss the case of why it is inevitable, right? And oftentimes we'll point to sort of Steve Jobs and we'll say, well, Steve Jobs always sort of quoted Henry Ford about, like, if you ask people what they wanted, they would have told you a faster horse, right? But if you go one level deeper than that and you say, well, why do you want a faster horse? What people would say was, because I want to get from point A to point B much, much quicker. And if you extrapolate that out, what you kind of realize is that over time, you're going to exceed the power of a horse and you're going to need something else. The point is that, oftentimes we kind of have to look to patterns like our daughters and their behavior in order to kind of understand, like, where is the world really headed? Because the best ideas, again, they're not just new and exciting. You actually make the case as to why it's inevitable. Like when Steve Jobs launched the iPhone, he said, like, I'm not you basically said, like, I'm not doing something that wasn't already going to happen. I'm simply skating to where the puck is already going.
It's a fascinating point, and I think if you keep that in the back of your mind, is this inevitable? I'm just going to get there faster, and I'm going to make it smoother, and I'm going to make it better than it otherwise would be.
Yeah.
We're not going to stutter step into this. This is happening, and I'm going to take charge of this. Getting a lot of questions coming in from the audience now, but let me just ask you this thing that stuck out to me. I made note of this. The story of instant cake mixes, you call it the Ikea effect, and I think you sort of described it as flipping outsiders to insiders. What does that mean?
Yeah, so in the 1940s, Betty Crocker introduces instant cake mixes to markets across America, and they're so excited about this product because they think it's going to sell like gangbusters. All you have to do is mix water into a mix, right? And then put it in a pan, put it in the oven, and voila, you get this tasty treat. Like, why wouldn't it sell? And so they're stunned when they find that this is not selling very well at all. And they're trying to figure out why. So they hired this psychologist, a guy by the name of Ernest Dykda, to go out into the field and start talking to homes across the country. And what Dykda finds was really fascinating. What he says is, you guys have made the process of making a cake too simple, too easy. You have removed the customer from the creative process. So his recommendation was, why don't you remove one ingredient, just one, and see what happens? And so he did. They removed the egg. And so now what you had to do is you had to crack and mix in your own fresh egg into the mix, and sales take off. Just rocket ship. And now when the cake comes out of the oven, customers felt like they were part of that process. They felt ownership over that cake. And since then, researchers have given a name to this effect, and they call it the Ikea effect, which is that we place up to 5 times the amount of value on something that we help build than something that we simply buy. And there are a lot of people with poorly made futons and furniture. I remember some of yours in your dorm room that showed you'll never get rid of, right? Because like you made it with your hands. And so like, what does this have anything to do with creativity and innovation? Well, we've been told that creativity is a 2-step formula. You come up with a great idea and you execute on it really well. But the fact is that there's a hidden step in between. And it's in this hidden step where we take outsiders of our ideas and we bring them in as builders, and we make it feel like it's their idea as well. Because that way, when we show up to the execution phase, we show up together. And I believe that you can literally trace every successful company, every successful movement back to this hidden step, flipping outsiders to insiders. In fact, I think it works for family as well. And we were talking a little bit about this.
Yeah, I mean, well, I got to ask about the family, but I just want to say it's so interesting, the egg thing you just mentioned. I think that's such a great metaphor, right? I mean, even for people who are trying to decide if you're backable or something, they want to feel that involvement, right? I mean, very few people just want to say, okay, I'm just going to do this and I have nothing else to do with it. No skin in the game, nothing. I'm interested in this. I'd like to be a part of it somehow. I think I could maybe help contribute. That's what the customer of the instant cake wanted, I guess, what you're saying.
Exactly.
They wanted some ownership of it.
They did. And you're reminding me of a very, very important story. So when Sanjay was maybe 15 years old, he starts a guitar air band. He starts a guitar air band, and I'm about 5 years old at this point, and I really want to be a part of this air band. Right? He's got his buddies in the basement. They're rocking out to Springsteen, to Led Zeppelin, and I want to be a part of this. So one of the things they did is they would film these videos. And so they literally would have a camera sitting on top of a tripod, and the stationary camera. And so one day Sanjay's like, okay, here's your role. Make sure that camera does not fall. So it's sitting on a tripod, camera's secure, but I feel like this is my job. So I sat there. I'd stand behind that camera and just stare at the camera to make sure that in no condition would some event happen to make the camera fall. But now I felt like I was a part of that. I remember when we would watch those videos, when we would like go upstairs and put them on, like put it in the VCR and watch those videos. I felt like that those were my creations as well. Like that was my egg. You handed me an egg, and I put it in the mix.
I did not know you were going to go there. And all that is, two things strike me. One is I think I was just trying to get you out of the way, which is why I told you to watch the camera, right? You're 5 years old. I mean, you get in the way. Second of all, I think you actually did knock over the camera once, if I remember correctly. But Suneel, it's a funny thing, because I remember even when you were, because people who don't know this, you ran for office. Suneel ran for office, ran for Congress, and you had to make a big move. San Francisco, where you were living, doing your thing out there, back to Michigan, which is our home state. You wanted to go back and run in our home state, in our home district. But you had a family now. You have Lena, you have daughters. You applied some of these same principles to that.
Well, yeah. So I'm learning about the IKEA effect literally as this is all happening, because I'm writing the book as well, and I'm paying attention to these things that I'm learning. And when I decided that I wanted to run, I go to my wife Lena and I say, look, this is something that I really want to do. We're living in San Francisco at the time, but how would you feel about moving to Michigan for me to run for public office? And she looks at me and she says, I hate that idea. So that's how it started.
For you.
I was starting at a very low point. And so, but over the next few months, it was basically this push-pull between the two of us. I would ask her again and she'd say no. And I'd ask her again and she'd say no. And eventually it sort of struck me that I was not using the stuff that I was learning. What I was trying to do was I was trying to sell her a piece of furniture. And she didn't want to buy that furniture. And so where we landed was really a plan that we kind of came up with together. And the plan was, look, I'm going to move to Michigan and I'm going to run for office. And if I win, then obviously we're going to stay. But if I lose, then you get the choice of the next location that we move to, no matter what, right? Your parents are on the East Coast. We can move there, whatever it is, you get that choice. Now, that didn't necessarily make her feel 100% great about the idea of leaving where we were in San Francisco and moving, but at least she felt like we were building something together. She felt like we were part of the plan. We were creating this piece of furniture together.
Well, look, it's an amazing strategy in this regard. And I think, the other part of it for Lena, and I obviously know the story well, is that I think she helped build the futon, if you will, right? It wasn't just, I'm going to move us to Michigan. She helped pick out where you were going to live, how life was going to unfold. There's the putting in the egg part of it, right? It's not just the move, that's it's right. that whole thing. And for people who don't know Lena, she also wrote this incredible article, because she's born in DC area, went to school in New York, went to school in Chicago, lived in San Francisco. And all of a sudden my brother is moving her to small town in Michigan. And how does someone like that cope? After you read Backable, you should Google her article. Where was it written again? Where was the
Elle magazine?
Elle magazine. Read this article. It's fascinating, and I know Lena well since a long time, but I still learned a lot there. Let's take a couple questions, and I want to ask you about the 4 C's after that. Okay, Suneel? This is a good question. This is from Al Wad, who says, "What tips do you have for introverts who may be shy when speaking or interviewing in person?"
Yeah. So, one of the things that I think I learned from a woman named Maureen Taylor, who's a coach for, entrepreneurs, executives, but really focuses on introverts. And one of the things she says is that, when you walk into a room for, an interview, a pitch, whatever it might be, you feel like the spotlight is on you. But what you really want to do is you want to, as quickly as possible, turn that spotlight to something else. You want to turn that spotlight to your message. You want to turn that spotlight to a visual of some sort, right? Something that you can showcase. You want to turn that spotlight sometimes to your central character, is something that I call in the book. And this is the person that you feel like you're representing when you're inside the room. There was a founder that I sort of watched pitch. A lot of what I did to research this book is I watched founders pitch investors as well, or people pitch ideas to different types of backers. And there was this founder who I found to be just an incredibly sort of charming person. He was definitely an introvert. He had a pizza app where all you had to do was you had to push a button and you get a pizza delivered from a local pizza place. So, it was an alternative to some of the big chains. And it was a really cool idea. And I got to the meeting early. And so when I was there, I started asking him some questions. I was just kind of getting to know him a little bit. And he pulls out his phone and he's showing me pictures of his family, because as it turns out, he's like a fourth generation pizza shop owner. So he's showing me pictures of his like grandfather in Italy, and you could see him sort of coming alive. But then as the investors started to come into the room, he kind of put on a little more of like the buttoned up demeanor that he felt like he should have. And he started to kind of almost talk the language that I think he thought these investors would want him to talk. And he became a lot more introverted, a lot more shy in those moments. So he's going through his slide deck the way that sort of most of these meetings go. And all of a sudden I asked him, I said, hey, you were showing me some of those photos in your app before. Could you give us a little bit of a demo? And so he does. He pulls out his phone, and literally all of us in the room kind of gather around. We almost huddle around him, and he starts to show off his app, right? And as he's showing off his app, as he's showing off these visuals, that energy starts to come back. Because again, at that moment, he doesn't feel like the spotlight is necessarily on him. The spotlight is on his message. The spotlight is on his content. It's on these visuals. So the thing that I would say, especially for people who are not totally comfortable speaking in front of audiences, is as quickly as possible, you want to shift from presentation mode to huddle mode, where you're kind of huddling around something together, taking the spotlight off of you and turning it to something else that you can huddle around.
I love that. I love that. And it reminds me a little bit of the famous quote from Maya Angelou as well, to some extent, Suneel. I'm not going to get it exactly right, but it's something along the lines of people may not always remember what you say, but they do remember how you made them feel. And if you're sharing things, fourth generation pizza, I wasn't even there, and that's evocative for me. I feel that, it feels like it's part of something larger than himself or us. It kind of fits to this, goes to this next question. This is from Steve Gregorian. It says, Suneel, authenticity probably plays a significant role in becoming backable. What are some ways to show authenticity?
One of my favorite stories from the book, it's an older story, but it was one that was told to me multiple times over by backable people. It almost seemed to kind of be a story that people kind of go to for inspiration, is about a guy named Dr. George Schaller. And Schaller is, Schaller is a famous primatologist. He mentored a woman named Diane Fossey, who was Sigourney Weaver, played her in the movie Gorillas in the Mist. And so Schaller was kind of seen as this legend in the field. And the thing about him is that he was able to get really, really close to these mountain gorillas that he was studying. And one day he's at a conference and he's presenting his research. And someone in the audience gets up and asks him, they say, Dr. Schaller, look, we've been studying these animals now for decades, if not centuries. How is it that you were able to get so close? And he says, it's simple. I never carried a gun. I never carried a weapon. And the reason that's really interesting is because, while other researchers carried a weapon, that weapon was always hidden away. It was in their backpack. So it's not like the animals sort of felt threatened, the gorillas felt threatened. But Schaller's theory was that while you can hide a weapon, you can't really hide your attitude around a weapon. You always had that sort of hidden agenda, which I think comes to this notion of authenticity, right? I've come to see the gun in the backpack as the desire to really impress people. I've come to see the gun in the backpack as the desire to be the smartest person in the room. Because what ends up happening is when you have that, when you're carrying that with you, it's very hard for you to be yourself. You kind of have that agenda. One of the mantras that I've kind of adopted through writing this book is always, and I tell myself this over and over again, because I have to remember this myself, which is to speak to express, not to impress. Speak to express, not to impress. So I think it plays a huge, huge role.
It's interesting. I've been, as you know, covering COVID a lot lately. And one of the things that comes up quite a bit is it's a little different. It's not pitching ideas, but these scientists are constantly they're briefing the president. constantly on what's happening with COVID. And it can be a very intimidating experience. I've talked to many of these scientists. What is it like? How do you prepare yourself? And one of the things that sort of struck me about this was that you have to, as you talked about earlier, be okay with failing or with maybe even getting fired after that meeting, because if you're not, that means you may do things that aren't completely accurate, or you may lose your authenticity because you're too fearful of the consequences versus just being able to just do it straight, give it straight, be honest, all of that. It's a little bit metaphorical, but I think it's just, authenticity comes in all sorts of different shapes and forms. But I think the idea that the truth matters no matter what, I think is part of it as well.
Yeah. Well, that brings up an interesting point too, because one of the questions I get asked all the time is about your transition from or expansion, we should say, from medicine to medicine and media, right? Like, I mean, the way they ask it is like, how did he do that? Right? Like, how did he get that job? And I think my sense, I mean, you remind me, because we've talked about this before, but being in the room for the very first time with the powers that be at CNN, where you don't have any on-air experience, you're not a journalist by training, I imagine that authenticity had a lot to do with it.
Yeah, I think so. It's interesting. I mean, I imagine one of the things that comes up a lot is that you don't, I guess, the thing about authenticity is it's just a natural state. I feel like, I think when it feels awkward, when it feels like you're not just being yourself, then you're not being authentic. I mean, I had a desire to try and at that time talk about health policy because I thought it wasn't being discussed enough, and it was like such a big part of how a country operates, and I wanted to and I've been studying it for a long time, and I thought that would be a good thing to talk about. But I had no expectation, to be honest with you, that there'd be any kind of job coming out of it. I had no context for that sort of thing, but I did believe in it. And I think that's really, it is important. I mean, you've profiled all these people in this book that have had these amazing successes, but I imagine for a lot of them, they didn't go in saying this is a slam dunk. I got this. And that's part of the authenticity, I guess, right? I mean, and not to mention, if it were easy, everyone would have done it. I know what I'm about to pitch you is hard. It's not easy. If it were easy, somebody would have already done it. I'm here with something that is going to change how the world looks in some way, or going to change how we look at the world in some way. There's going to be stumbles and all that sort of stuff. I'm not the most eloquent guy. I stutter a lot. All that sort of stuff. But I really believe in this, and so maybe that's the authenticity. And we're getting a lot of questions about that, Suneel. But I do want to ask about something that has come up a few times now. A few questions. I'll take this one from John Myers, who says, "I really liked your mother's story." John, thank you. So do we. It's an amazing story. In your research, Suneel, did you find any general gender tendencies in terms of being backable? What about that gender breakdown?
Mm-hmm. Well, absolutely. I mean, look, if you look at the world of venture capital, just in general, women right now receive less than 10% of the venture capital funding. Black women right now receive less than, I think the number is 0.0006% of venture capital funding that's out there. Bias is an unavoidable topic when you're talking about backable. They're intrinsically linked. And I wish the book had some kind of systemic sort of answer to all of this, because if I found it, I certainly would have just written about that. But I didn't. And I think that the reality is that when the person who's sitting across the table from you looks different than you, I think that there is some inherent bias. It could be unconscious, it could be conscious, but there is bias. I do think that what we were talking about before, about really trying to shift from the presentation mode into huddle mode, or shifting into a place where you're actually representing someone else or something else, becomes even more important in that situation. Sanjay is pretty familiar with the company that I started, but it was this nutrition coaching company. And part of the reason that I started it is because our father, we saw our father really struggle with his health early on, had a triple bypass surgery when he was in his 40s. And, it was a story that really sort of stuck with me, which is that when we left the hospital, I remember they gave us a piece of paper, and the piece of paper said stuff like eat broccoli, eat Brussels sprouts. Yeah, but we were an Indian family. We didn't eat broccoli. We didn't eat Brussels sprouts. And so, we had to really sort of put a lot of work into kind of customizing a diet that would fit our lifestyle. And obviously, Sanjay had a huge role to play with that. The idea behind the company was to make that more possible for lots of people. But the way that I approached that pitch to start out with is I thought to myself, like, nobody is going to get that, because like the people I'm talking are predominantly like white men. And I'm talking about like an inherently like minority story. And so I would kind of bury that story to the very end, and I would talk about the numbers, and I would talk about the market. And then I ended up pitching Tim Ferriss, who is an author and he's invested in companies. And I was pitching him on the idea, and I told that story at the very end. And he said, "Man, why are you leaving that story to the very end? Like, you should tell that story up front." Because, and I said, well, part of the reason I don't tell that story up front is because like it's a different story than the people that I don't know if they're going to get it. And he's like, "No, you tell that story because you want them to get it. So you tell it through the eyes of one person first. You really make them feel that one person's pain. And then you talk about the numbers, and then you talk about the market." And so I did. I switched it. I used to talk about the rising rates of diabetes and hypertension and obesity and the market size. And then I would talk about Dad's story. I ended up flipping that, and I went right straight to Dad's story. And I really put these guys who I don't think really experienced exactly that, but I put them into his story. And then I talked about the number of people out there, the millions of people out there that are going through their own version of that. It worked much better.
The story matters. I mean, I think that was a theme that came through. First of all, the stories in your book are great because they are emblematic of some particular lesson. But you remember the story, and I can't help but think, Suneel, today, just before I came on air, so tragically we crossed the 500,000 people who have died of COVID, numbers. And I've been reporting on this for a year. And I did this podcast some time ago with these researchers out of University of British Columbia, and they talked about this concept known as empathy fatigue or compassion fade. You tell the story of one person and something that's happening to them, and you get a lot of empathy, a lot of compassion. I tell you that same story 10 times, and you're not only are you not giving 1/10 as much compassion or empathy, your overall level of empathy or compassion can go down. It's an amazing thing. I mean, it's sad. Psychologically, it's sad, but I think it speaks to what you're saying. You have to get people to understand the story. And sometimes it's a story of one individual who is emblematic of so many others. We got so many questions now, so I want to get to some more of these, okay? Because we could talk all evening, but people are asking really good questions here. Alfredo Rodriguez asks, going back to the authenticity, and I'm curious about this. Is the authenticity and the conviction really a consequence of deeply knowing yourself? So what about it for you? Did you have to sort of go on, you talked about your journey, but did you have to get to really know yourself? Because people can live with a facade. They could be even fooling themselves.
Yeah. I think the answer is absolutely yes. And one of the things that coincided with this book is that in 2012, I call up Sanjay and I'm like, "Look, I just had my first child. I'm starting this company. I'm trying to get it off the ground. I'm really kind of burning out. Like, what do I need to do?" And one of the things that Sanjay recommended to me at that time was, "Why don't you try meditation?" And so I did. I started in Thanksgiving of 2012, and I have not missed a day since. It's become a huge part of my life, a daily part of my life. And I think that has helped me get to know myself better. I mean, look, you're not spending that 15 minutes to 20 minutes for me, trying to say like, who am I? But I think that the notion of sort of pausing, taking that pause in your day every day, I think has led to me getting to know myself better. That's also gone to another technique that Sanjay inspired me to do and talks about in his book, Keep Sharp, which is to journal, which is to just put things down on paper, stream of consciousness every day. And that kind of leads me, I think, not only to sort of fleshing out my ideas, but it also just kind of starts, I start to just kind of get to know what's really going through my head a little bit better. It's funny. One of the people that I talk about in the book is Salman Rushdie. And, he's one of my favorite authors, and he was passing through town in Chicago when I was living in Chicago, and I really wanted to like meet him. So I emailed him like 4 times. And finally, after the 4th email, he's like, all right, fine. He's like, I'll meet with you. I'm going to be at this location. If you show up, at this time, I'll have 5 minutes then. And so I get to this restaurant, and I know I only have 5 minutes. So I hit him with like the question I really want to ask, which is like, how do you get inspired to write? And I could tell immediately it was like the worst question I could have asked him. Like he kind of rolls his eyes and he's just like, he like takes a pause and he like makes direct eye contact so that I would really understand what he was about to say next. He says, I don't, oh, did we lose Sanjay?
I'm still here. Can you not see me?
Oh, you still here?
Yeah, sorry.
Okay.
I can still hear you. Go ahead.
That was like
I'll
the
fix
best
my
part,
camera.
man.
I'm listening.
All right. So he's
I'm listening.
okay.
I'm not looking at my phone or anything. Don't worry. My phone, my
Salman
camera
Rushdie
died.
says, okay. So Salman Rushdie says, I don't get inspired to write. I just write. And most of what I write ends up in the trash bin. Most of what I write is not usable, but buried in that pile each day is a small pearl. And what I do is I string together those pearls into sentences and eventually paragraphs and eventually chapters and eventually books. The reason I bring that up is because like, I think we could spend a lot more time just like writing stream of consciousness stuff that's just never going to get used. And that's okay. It can be throwaway work, but it really helps us get to know ourselves, who we are, so that when we walk into the room, we're bringing that true sense of ourselves.
I love that. By the way, I was totally listening the whole time, just so you know, my camera died. But this is conversations with my kids all the time. I'm telling them something that I think is like just pure gold. And right away they're like, they're on TikTok. I'm like, wait a second, why? Let's get to a couple more here because there's so many questions coming in. Susan Lyon says, seems like you're only taking questions from men, she says. But then Susan, you didn't have a question. You just asked me about, so let's take a question from Michelle then, who is not a man, I don't think. How can we turn quarantine into the incubation period you mentioned and create something positive and life-changing? That's a good question. I mean, we are in this sort of, this sort of hunkered down time. Is this a good time for incubation?
Yeah, I think it's a great time for incubation. I'm finding, and I want you to chime in here too, Sanjay. Like, I'm finding that people are kind of taking it in one of 2 directions, though. So not all of us, by the way, have more time in our days. Some of us have less now, right? But for those of us who are lucky enough, where we actually do have a little bit more time in our days because we're saving that commute time and we're not replacing it with anything else. What I'm seeing is that people are moving in one of 2 directions. Either they're using that time and cramming in more meetings. Like to do more Zooms, do more meetings. And then there are other people who are actually taking the time to use creativity. Like, let's channel some creativity. Let's do some writing. A lot of us tend to think our best in the morning, first thing in the morning when we might otherwise be on the road. So let me take that time to actually start taking some of the ideas that are in my head and putting them down on paper. Let me start to use some of the basic tools that are out there to kind of start sketching things out. And it's really just kind of a wonderful you to see, because what I found is that creativity doesn't really come in these just like massive bursts where all of a sudden like you burst out and you're like, all right, I got it, and like I'm gonna write it all down. I've had this thing that has been germinating in my head, and now I'm gonna like spend the next 5 hours and bust it out. Every once in a while that happens, but more often what I've found is that creativity comes in consistency. It's that 20 to 30 minutes that you're spending, but you're spending it on a daily basis. And in some ways, Sanjay, it's kind of like the weight loss that we talked about, which is like, when you kind of find that there are certain people who work out for like 1 to 2 hours, 1 to 2 times a week, and they post like a sweaty selfie on Instagram, they're dripping, right? And then you have these other people who are working out for like 20 to 30 minutes every single day. And sometimes they post a selfie and you're like, wait, was that before the workout or after the workout? I can't even really tell. But they're working out consistently. And by far, those tend to be the people that get the best results because they're spending just time each day on this goal. And so I think using this quarantine time, I think to spend consistent time with your craft, consistent time with your creativity, I think is going to take us a long way.
I think you're absolutely right. And I've sort of imagine a lot of people listening has sort of eased into a particular way of life during this quarantine time. I mean, we didn't know how long it was going to last initially, so it was hard for me to get my rhythm, because is this how temporary? How long is this going to last? And but I think you're right. In the morning times in particular, I think too often that time is wasted by immediately responding to emails, and it's some of your best creative time for most people, not for everybody. People are different. There are people who are much more late night people, but physiologically, if you can use that morning time, I think the trade-off is significant, maybe 3 to 4 to 1. If I do the same activity at 7 o'clock at night versus 7 o'clock in the morning, I'm about 25% as creative as an efficient. That's a made up number, but it's significant. Let's take one more question before we start. What time are we supposed to wrap things up? Do you even know, Suneel?
I think around now. It's about 7. It's about 7:30.
All right, let me.
We're getting pretty. I think we're getting pretty close.
All right, let me ask this. I do want to get to this other question, Leela Cherry, because I think this is really good, and this will start helping wind us down. She says your mother is awesome. Thank you, Leela. We know. Authenticity is what makes you backable, Suneel. How much of the backability was connected? How much of backability is connected to a person's spiritual development? I guess this sort of goes into a little bit of what you were talking about earlier, but I am curious. I mean, you took a very holistic approach in this book.
Gosh, well, I'm working on a new book now that I think is going to be very related to just that question, because I'm trying to find the answer. And just like Backable, I'm coming at it not because I have a solution, but because I have a question, I have a problem that I'm trying to answer. And I do think that there is a connection between, I think a deeper connection between spirituality and some of the things that we're talking about. The Bhagavad Gita, Sanjay, you and I were talking about this very recently. I mean, one of the core concepts of the Bhagavad Gita, which we were raised on, is detachment. Right? Is this idea that you can fully devote yourself to a process, and then be detached from the outcome, knowing that the reward was in the process itself, right? And I know that comes off as very sort of Eastern, and might seem like mumbo jumbo for a lot of people. But what's interesting is that, like, when we look at some people here in the West who we consider to be top performers, they say very much sometimes the same thing. Like LeBron James was asked the other day, like, what is the LeBron mindset? And LeBron James responded, like, the LeBron mindset is that I never, ever think about the trophy when I'm on the court. That's just never something that I think about. I'm able to perform in that moment, that one moment, that split second that matters so much, because that's never on my mind. It's just where I am. It's just that moment. And if you've read A Promised Land with Barack Obama's book, I mean, it was really interesting because he talked about the fact that when he was on the campaign, his staff kept calling him out about the fact that he was ambivalent. He seemed too ambivalent. Like, there's this moment with your friend David Axelrod where he pulled him aside and was like, hey, the problem, Barack, is that, it seems like you'd be happy whether or not you win. And Barack's like, yeah, you're right. I would be happy whether or not I win. And so I guess this thing that we sort of look at, I think inherently in the West, is sort of like a you must win sort of attitude, like you have to, and you have to be intense. I think we're finding that that's not always the case amongst, I think, some of these really, really high performers. And I'm interested in that at a spiritual level.
I think that's then the new book, which I've read the proposal for this as well, and had a very similar reaction to what I had when I read the proposal for Backable. It's going to be great. I'm not going to give it the title away. I'm not even sure if that's a formal title, but I'm glad you've been thinking about these things a lot. You have access to all these incredible people. So the idea that you're now making that available for people more widely through these books, I think, is fantastic. Okay, just two things before we start wrapping up. Ronnie Selig asked a question, and it's going to be too long an answer right now, and we're out of time. So you're going to have to call Ronnie Selig and tell her your answer.
I'll call Ronnie.
The idea that got away, that was the question.
The idea that got away. Ronnie, I'm calling you.
Ronnie, call Ronnie Selig. 4 C's. Now, there's a whole big description behind the 4 C's, and people should buy the book and get the book to read what they all mean. But just tell us what the 4 C's are.
All right, so just real quick. What I found is that backable people tend to surround themselves with a circle. And what I found is I started to look at these different circles, that there tended to be the same 4 types of people in each circle, at least these 4 types of people, which I now call the 4 C's. So the first C is your collaborator. Your collaborator. So you're with this person, you feel like you're in a musical jam session together. They're always using words like yes, and they're building on top of your ideas. Your collaborator. Your second is your coach. And while your coach is really focused on, or sorry, while your collaborator is really focused on whether your idea really fits the market, whether it fits your company, your coach is really trying to figure out whether the idea fits you. Because there's a lot of great ideas out there that may not make you tick. So your coach is the person who's going to give you that insight as well. The third is your cheerleader. Pretty self-explanatory. They're your champion, the people who you look to for that last bit of confidence before you walk into the room. I talked to this woman who was named Silicon Valley's most connected woman, and she's got members of Congress in her Rolodex. She's got Fortune 500 CEOs, and I asked her, who you call before you walk into the room? And she said, that's easy. I call my mom. So your cheerleader. And the fourth, which I think is the least appreciated of the circle, is your critic. But I like to call this person your cheddar, because if you've ever seen the movie 8 Mile, Eminem is surrounded by a group of friends who are always kind of building him up. But there's one friend named Cheddar who's always kind of poking holes in his ideas, always saying, yeah, but what about this? And we all have a cheddar in our lives, and that person can be kind of annoying, but it's also the person that really helps us get ready for a room. We learn throughout the film, through 8 Mile, that it's Cheddar that got Eminem ready for the stage. And this is the person that's going to poke holes and show us our blind spots, but they always have our best intention at heart. So those are the 4 C's.
You know, it's just like we were saying earlier, like as soon as you start describing that, I bet you everybody who's listening starting to think, well, who is my collaborator? Who is my cheerleader? Who's my cheddar?
Yeah.
You know, it's so relevant, Suneel. So we got to wrap it up, because again, you and I, we have these conversations, and Suneel and I, by the way, we're really close. I imagine that most siblings are close, but Suneel and I are really close, and we'll get on these phone calls and talk for hours on end. And today we got to do it in front of all of you, and I'm eternally grateful for that, Suneel. Again, very proud of you. I do want to say as well, we talked a lot about mom. Dad, we love you as well. You're also very special. Dad's thinking, you know, no one ever pays any attention to the dads. I get it now that I'm a dad myself, but we love you as well.
We love you, Dad.
We love you, Dad. You want to just leave us with anything, Suneel, like the meaning of life or anything like that?
Well, you know what, Brad, I do ask my daughter 2 questions every morning. I ask her, what is the meaning of life? And she says, to find your gift. And I say, what is the purpose of life? And she says, to give it away. Fundamentally, this book is all about how do we give our gift away. So Brad, thank you so much for the opportunity. Sanjay, I love you. Thanks for being here with me on this.
Thanks, everybody.
So this is the first time that we've had a big brother in conversation with a younger one at a Politics and Prose author talk, and you two, I must say, have set a very high bar. And Suneel, you definitely got your message across this evening, showing that whatever skills go into Backable, you certainly have them. To all of you watching, thanks again for tuning in. A reminder that in the chat column, you can find links to purchase Suneel's book, Backable, and Sanjay's recent book, Keep Sharp. From all of us here at Politics and Prose, stay well and well read.